I think the recording has already been started, and without taking much more time, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking out time on this hot, sweltering afternoon and joining us for this book talk. This COVID-19 pandemic world order which we are living in, it's truly changed the world, and it would be an understatement to say that it has impacted the world, and we've suffered so much in terms of the loss of lives, the collapse of public health systems, economic growth rates have been lost. What has also been witnessed as a corollary to the pandemic is an altered international political system. China, which is the origin place of the virus, emerged as a much more aggressive player in the international system, unleashing myriad forms of hostilities with other states in the international system, be it with the US or with Vietnam or with Taiwan or with India. China, what it tried to do is that it tried leveraging the pandemic by unleashing its vaccine diplomacy, its medical diplomacy, its narratives on COVID and COVID-19 as to how its zero COVID strategy has done wonders, while the rest of the world is actually burdened and does not know how to control a pandemic, etc., etc. So China became hyper aggressive whenever the question of tracing the causes of the virus came up, while it was utilizing the pandemic for unleashing all sorts of diplomacy, trying to showcase itself as a responsible player in the international system, what it was also doing is that whenever there was a question of true responsibility for the pandemic, China got hyper aggressive. So it resorted to things like weaponization of trade against countries like Australia, which spoke about how there needs to be an independent investigation into the origins of the virus. Now China's foreign policy has become a new paradigm in international politics. China wants to signal that it's the most powerful player in the international system. Other countries have to simply accept its hostile takeover of the leadership role in the international system. It uses a wide ranging set of tools, including weaponization of information, artificial intelligence, weaponization of trade, weaponization of water, and so on. In this context, Ms. Gaurie Dwivedi's book, Blinkers Off, How Will the World Counter China, becomes very pertinent. Now, Blinkers Off, How Will the World Counter China, is a book that highlights the non-military challenges of an assertive China. The book makes a case that China has successfully weaponized the information domain, technology, and its trade superiority. The book puts forth suggestions on addressing some of these anomalies in the post-Cold War era, where America is unlikely to counter China. About Ms. Dwivedi, she's a senior journalist, she's a commentator, she's an author. Her first book, Blinkers Off, How Will the World Counter China, was recently published and has received multiple rave reviews. It's been reviewed in most national dailies and international journals. The book has become a catalyst and a call for action to address many challenges that a rising China is presenting to the world. The book highlights also the opportunities which are there for India. In her 17-year journalism career, Ms. Dwivedi has worked in both broadcast as well as in print mediums. She has written on a variety of issues ranging from diplomacy to foreign policy to finance and public policy. She regularly contributes to several newspapers and journals. She's also a visiting fellow with India Foundation and with the USI. She's spoken extensively on webinars hosted by Hudson Institute, by the RAND Corporation, amongst others. She's also a classical dancer, recognized by the Government of India as an outstanding artist. She's an alumnus of Delhi School of Economics and Lady Shri Ram College. What makes this book and today's talk even more interesting is that it is written by a strong woman like Ms. Dwivedi. Women's voices in a traditionally male-dominated field like IR are very few, which is why voices such as those of Ms. Dwivedi truly make this an occasion to cheer for. So without taking more of your time, Ms. Dwivedi, please enlighten us with your book talk.
Dr. Pathak, thank you very much for a very, very generous introduction. And yes, you're right that IR, unfortunately, is one of those fields that has fewer women voices. And it's good that I see you here as well on the panel. The book you brightly mentioned comes at an opportune time, since so much has been spoken about in the last 2 years in terms of being an eye-opener for what China really stands for, what China has been able to achieve, and more importantly, what it wishes to achieve in terms of using its potential and using its ability across various domains. But the first thing I want to talk about regarding this book is the title itself. Why is it that it's titled Blinkers Off, and what blinkers am I really asking my readers to take off? The book says that arising China's challenges are not unidimensional only on the military front. Does a rising China or a stronger China mean that there will be border conflicts with India on LAC? Does it mean that there will only be more frigates and submarines in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea? Or does it also mean that a rising China will challenge the notions in which liberal economic trade takes place? Will it also challenge the international trade domains? Will it also weaponize its ability to be able to test information mediums and build false narratives against countries? Will it also mean that China will use its ability to create falsehoods when it comes to narratives and also use technology to its advantage? Weaponize some of these areas, as Dr. Pathak earlier mentioned. That is what the book talks about, and those are the blinkers that the book wants, or that I want my readers to take off, which is that China's challenges are not just on the military aspect. They are non-military in aspect, which are more urgent, more pressing, and needs a bigger concerted response, which is trade, technology, outer space, biological warfare, as well as the ability to weaponize multilateral platforms like UN, WTO, and WHO. Who thought that WHO would have feet of clay in the middle of a global pandemic? But it did. And that happened because China managed to use that platform as well to its advantage. This is another form of weaponizing, which is its own, its ability to weaponize a global platform. Likewise, and lastly, but equally important, information narratives. And that's why the book urges the readers to remove the blinkers and see what China stands for. Very quickly, I'll take you through what the book, the premise of the book is, and what all does it entail. First is the first half of the book talks about the rise of China and talking about the clout that China has and influence that it has in every part of the world, whether it is Europe, whether it is Asia, whether it is Africa, or for that matter, Washington's own backyard, Latin America. The extent of clout and influence that China wields in these geographies may be very normal and something that a lot of students of IR may know, like Dr. Pathak and Dr. Panigrahi may know, but a lot of other decision makers may not be aware of the extent of China's influence when it comes to any of these geographies, whether it is Europe or Asia or Africa, as I said. And I'm going to read just one paragraph from the book to just point out why writing about China's influence is the starting point towards understanding what needs to be done to counter it. From football teams to strategic infrastructure like ports and airports, China's influence in Europe has grown exponentially in less than 2 decades. In the last decade alone, Chinese companies gained ownership of 4 airports, including the Frankfurt-Hahn Airport in Germany, one of the main ones, 6 ports, and a dozen professional soccer clubs in Europe. It was only in 2019 that Europe decided that it must start screening investments coming in from China. But this was also the year when Beijing proved that its clout and influence was so pronounced that it dictated whether Europe could even condemn gross human rights violations by the Communist Party of China or not. So this explains why the first half of the book talks about why we need to counter China. What exactly is it that China represents that needs to be countered? It represents enormous and disproportionate clout and influence, and it also represents methods and mechanisms that seem to indicate non-peaceful attempts to weaponize, as I mentioned, different domains of engagement, of interaction, and which is why China's rise matters to every part of the world. So that's the first half of this book, which talks about in detail why China's rise impacts everybody and why China's rise matters to every country in the world. Now, going on to why China's rise is not peaceful. It's it's, as I said, its ability to weaponize everything needs to be countered. Now, specifically, I'm going to talk about economic warfare. China is now the world's second largest economy, and its trade impacts many countries. And there are 120 countries in the world which are either first or second largest in terms of trading partners with China. All of Asian countries, and 16 of them particularly, have China as their single largest trading partner. So if China decides to make changes unilaterally to any trade equations, economies of at least 16 Asian countries, I will not use the word devastated, but severely damaged. Specific examples have been given in the book which talk about how China has been able to weaponize this trading muscle. We all know about Australia in 2020, when Australia talked about how really did COVID virus originate and it wanted an independent inquiry. China unleashed what is part of its textbook usage of economic muscle. Overnight, it made changes to those commodities which have massive export coverage and massive export exposure to China, which is iron ore, coal, where 60 to 75% of Australian coal and iron ore goes to China. So those changes caused billions of dollars of damage. But this is not new. The book highlights what happened in 2010. It highlights what happened in Mongolia. It highlights what happened in 2017 in South Korea. When Seoul decided to implement and put in place the missile defense system that America gave it, after North Korea's multiple missile launches, what China did was exactly what happened with Australia 3 years later. It decided to impose punitive damages on specific South Korean goods and products which had disproportionate exposure to China. And how in detail this was done, that while the impact on Chinese companies was sub $500 million, it was $1.5 billion for the South Korean companies. Add to it the fact that China is 25 times bigger than South Korea in terms of economic size and could therefore absorb this kind of a shock. Another example is that of Norway. In 2010, it was the Nobel Committee that decided to give the Peace Prize to a Chinese dissenter, late Liu Xiaobo. And because the Chinese thought that this was orchestrated by the Norwegian government, they decided to then overnight impose ban on salmon exports. 90% of Norwegian salmon exports go to China. No wonder it was salmon that was chosen. And then, of course, it fell down to sub 25%. It recovered to 29 odd percent. But the fact is, it fell from over 90% to about 25%. The bilateral investment treaty that Norway and China were evaluating and discussing also fell apart because China took exception to the Nobel Peace Prize given to its dissenter. These are examples that identify what a rising China means to the world. Now imagine, this is scenario that I'm projecting, after what has happened in the Ukraine issue, China decides, or Xi Jinping decides, to act on his multiple provocations related to Taiwan, and does go ahead with some of what he had said in the past, that Taiwan unification is something that is very much on the cards, and the CCP will ensure it happens. If at all he acts on this demand or commitment that is made on multiple occasions, can the world economy then look at making the same demands of disengagement that NATO is making with Russia? Can that happen? especially in the backdrop of the kind of economic commitments that China has with every other part of the world, and especially in the backdrop of how China reacts whenever whenever there is a geopolitical issue that is unpalatable to it. So that's important, that needs to be kept in mind, that when you have a country so large or economy as large as China, always using economy and its economic muscle for its geopolitical objectives, how can that really be used or can be tackled when it is matters such as Taiwan, or for that matter, even India? If at all in the aggression against India increases by China, how will the world respond? Can it use the same textbook playbook that NATO and Mr. Biden is using right now, which is that we're going to ban Russian oil, that we're going to stop having anything to do with economic engagement with Russia? Can that happen in the case of China? No. Then what can happen? That is the question that this book really attempts to answer, or even raises in a larger voice. Second important aspect is technology. Now, a lot has been spoken and written, which is very good in the last couple of years, about how technology will be the next frontier in terms of any possible battleground between clash of countries, clash of ideas. But how much will technology usage determine the overall working as far as any country is concerned, is what needs to be kept in mind. And secondly, how the CCP and how the Chinese use technology for their geopolitical objectives also needs to be kept in mind. While for us, technology means the digital economy, it means adding up in terms of our economic prowess and growth. For the Chinese and for the CCP in particular, it means another possible avenue of being able to weaponize against its primary rivals. And when I say primary rivals, it's America and India. Those are the primary rivals. Japan historically may have been a rival, but it's not a primary rival anymore for China. Even though Japan has a larger economy than India, it's a stagnant economy, its pacifist constitution and its pacifist people ensure that at no point of time will there ever be a concerted response against Chinese aggression. They will always fall back to their alliance with America, and that's factored in by the Chinese. It's factored in by the CCP. So it's India and America which are the primary rivals when it comes to China. And in both these domains, which is your technology and how technology can be used for larger geopolitical objectives, this will be a very important arena that the Chinese will focus on. Cybersecurity, cyber crimes are some of the biggest areas that the Chinese, along with the Russians, focus on. There are reports, there are no clear estimates because it's difficult to predict the original person who committed the crime, or the original entity that committed the cyber crime, because the path has become far more sophisticated. They are not so easily traceable. But still, there are reports that indicate maximum number of cyber crimes that are committed in India are originated by Chinese entities. I use the word entities because they can be people, they can be affiliated to the state, they may not be affiliated to the state, so on and so forth. But they are Chinese entities. These are the largest set of groups. We see similar problems that America faces against both Russia and China. So cyber crime is one of the biggest examples of where the next clash could be. And I'll give a specific example. Every piece of infrastructure now has a digital backbone. And all of these can be connected, they can be used, and there can be remote operation of impacting the net user or the final user of these infrastructure. There was an example and there was a possibility that the Mumbai train, the local train, was impacted technologically and hacked by Chinese entities. It was a possibility. It was not evaluated, or for whatever reasons, we don't know the final outcome. But those examples are not something that cannot happen. They can happen, they have happened in other parts of the world, and the frequency with which they will happen will only increase as China grows and aggression of Xi Jinping grows. And that's what is important. Likewise, when you talk about the digital backbone, there is the digital Silk Road that the Chinese are now building, which is 75 countries will have their entire data networks soon across each other in parallel in single undersea cables and data that can be easily accessible. It's not just about weather data that we're talking about. We're talking about submarine data. We are talking about financial data. If that data can be mined through AI, through other technology, then we are looking at a possibility of large scale damage that can be done through digital crimes, through cyber crimes, and using technology. These are the future frontiers of war. The future frontiers of war are not a submarine in the South China Sea. I'm not undermining that. That's not the idea of this conversation. I'm not undermining those traditional mediums of warfare. They are equally important. But these are the new age challenges, technology, because A, they are more difficult to respond to, and B, there is no global standardized response to it. Is there a standardized response that if a train in Israel, by the way, is now receiving maximum investments from China under BRI, some of them as close to about 500 meters from the US Sixth Fleet at the Haifa port. So close, about less than 1 kilometer. So if some of those investments can be digitally hacked and can be used for military objectives, what is the global response to that? Or is there a standardized response to it? Which is the entity which will be on whose doors Tel Aviv will go and knock on? Is it going to be the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union? They'll say, we don't know, we don't have the standards as yet. Will it go to the UN, or will it have to deal with it on its own? Do nations have that ability to deal with something of this magnitude on their own? Those are future frontiers of warfare that China is already eyeing and need a response. In fact, on the digital economy bit and on the undersea cable bit, I'm going to quote from one of the US government documents, where it says that in response to China's building the 12,000 kilometer peace cable, which is the Pakistan, East Africa, connecting Europe cable, which ends in France. A US government paper has said that although undersea cable laying is a business, it is also a battlefield where information can be obtained and used. So there is a realization that this is the next frontier that needs to be handled. The book asks, what is going to be the response? Do we have those responses in place? Should data localization be the new format? Should 6G standards be put in place by the ITU? Should some of these entities like a WHO or WTO or the ITU given teeth? There is no point having organizations where there are only discussions and meetings that can take place with no outcome whatsoever, and no member, especially as large as China, has even an iota of regard for why these multilateral institutions are there in the very first place. So those are some of the important areas that the book hopes that a larger discussion will begin on. And in fact, outer space is another such example. In multilateral platforms, the book Blinkers Off goes in great detail to identify how China is one of the lowest donors to these organizations, and now has highest number of professionals working there. And it also talks about how China has made changes in its law, where the Chinese, no matter where they are working, in which multilateral organization they are working, which oath they are supposed to take, the first oath they take is that of the CCP. They are answerable and accountable to the Chinese Communist Party, whether for conducting espionage, whether for getting information, or whether for fulfilling the CCP's agenda and objective in any part of the world. So unless we know how to respond to it, entities like the UN, already struggling, will become completely defunct. So those are the questions that I hope that I could raise through this book, and start a larger discussion that could provide answers to some of these going forward. And on that, I will hand it back to you, Sriparna, to take this forward, Dr. Pathak, and continue with this discussion.
Thank you so much. And, it was such a power packed discussion. There's so many topics which have been covered, and a lot of these domains are things which we don't really know that much about. And China is already making full use of them. So, which is why, this topic and this book become even more important. And we definitely need to look into these emerging domains like cloud technology or AI, etc., because that's where the future is. And it's going to be difficult if we don't start taking cognizance of the strides that China is making in these domains. I would now like to invite my colleague, Dr. Manoj Kumar Panigrahi, to take over as moderator for the question and answers. But before I do that, if I may, take this opportunity, I would like to ask the first question. Sorry, I'm taking undue advantages of being, the co-host for this session. I had one question with regards to, weaponization of trade. If we look back right at 2010, when the Senkaku Islands dispute flared up between China and Japan, China had stopped its export of rare earth metals, and Japan was scrambling because Japan is a technologically superior country. It relies on technological exports. Then, for a very short duration, India and Japan got together, and we thought about recycling some of these used batteries, etc., and getting the rare earths out. My question is, what happened after that? Like, why is the world really so short-sighted? Why don't we actually have these deeper linkages so that every time China weaponizes trade, we have some sort of response ready? Why is it that we are so short-sighted? China must have done something to, get this sort of acquiescence from us. But what exactly is it?
Hmm. I'm glad, Dr. Pathak, you pointed that specific example. Yes, after Senkaku Islands, there was an attempt to, institutionalize some sort of a response. But the fact is that response cannot be done by two countries. And the reason for that is China is in the entire supply chain. So how can two countries come and respond against a player which has, or an economy which has presence in the entire supply chain? So it cannot be done only just at the level of, an India or a Japan or an Australia. It has to be done in a more synchronized manner. And since that time, since that incident, China now controls supply chains of all major rare earth metals, of all minerals, of all resources. And in fact, on some of these areas like a solar energy or a solar panel or a solar battery, it now dictates both the input as well as the output, which means it can not only dictate the raw material, it also dictates prices. So like cobalt, for instance. So in those areas, there has to be now an institutionalized and synchronized, but a pan, global response. It cannot be done by one or two economies because China is so big.
Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Panigrahi.
Okay, thank you, Professor Pathak, and thank you, Ms. Gaurie, for your wonderful and powerful talk. I will now ask the audience to put out their questions. So I think I can see one question, Yukti. I think if you want, you can I can ask Mr. Dwivedi directly your question. Yeah.
Okay, so the question is North Korea, right? Is that the question?
Yes,
okay.
The question is about North Korea.
I'll just read it out. China. It says, how do we analyze North Korea in the contemporary geopolitics vis-a-vis China? Are they getting closer, or is North Korea trying to act more independent now? I think whoever can solve the North Korean puzzle should be a multimillionaire, or would be one if they knew what was happening inside Pyongyang. But having said that, that's the only leverage that China has against South Korea. and against US in that region. Despite being a military alliance partner, South Korea is not completely aligned to America. And the reason for that is because China has that leverage with North Korea. A missile that starts from Pyongyang takes 4 minutes to reach Seoul. It still takes 9 minutes to reach Tokyo, but it takes 4 minutes to reach Seoul. And they know that the only way that we can counter against this or have some sort of a cushion against this is through Beijing. So China will always keep that handle alive, because that way it will forever be relevant in North Asia vis-a-vis America. Not just on its own, it is an important player there, but also to balance American interests, because America has two alliance partners there, Korea and Japan. This is the only way they can counter it. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. for your response. And by the time we get more questions, I think I can just sum up what you just mentioned. Okay, we saw. Let me just sum up. I think you're mentioning about economic warfare and the technological warfare and outer space does make valid points of what we are facing right now. And also, I would just like to add on to this. This the hunting of the scholars, of the newspaper journalists, think tank organizations from the Chinese embassy side, where they brought up to China through different programs on a well-paid vacation or a well-paid conferences, and so that they can be positive news towards towards China. And we have seen this throughout when we see during the Galwan incident, a lot of journalists in India came up with the full-blown reports about how it is why this incident happened is the India's own fault. So this thing can be, I think else also makes sense. And you mentioned about Australia 2020. I still remember I was in Taiwan, and there was a big support for Australian wine over there, because the kind of blockage all of a sudden that happened by the Chinese side immediately right after the COVID started. And of course, we have seen how the Nobel Committee has expanded, and Taiwan being excluded from WHO right after the COVID pandemic started. Even though there was multiple at the beginning few years, Taiwan was doing 0 COVID cases per day for the 2 years until recently. Following this, I will again, this questions comes up that you raised up in the point that what does rising China means. Following that, I will come up back to our questions from our audiences. I think Mr. Gaj, he has mentioned something, asked questions. Okay, I'll just go line after Mr. Mohan. His comment says, there has been discussions about forming a global NATO in recent times among the European countries. Would this have any effect on the Quad nations? And what does this mean for India? Is it a beneficial development as more European countries are subscribing to the Indo-Pacific notion, or is it associated with something that unnecessarily widens our continental scope?
Okay, so this is a non-starter. This is a non-starter because EU itself is a no player in the Indo-Pacific, barring France, because France has huge territories in the Indo-Pacific. They are the second largest country in terms of the amount of continental area they have. So they are the only ones who really have presence here. And beyond that, I don't think this is even worth considering. Quad is not going to be impacted by any of these ideas, because this is still a very this is a utopian idea which cannot function and which cannot translate into action, simply because EU itself is very divided internally, and they are not going to have a concerted single response and an action plan in the Indo-Pacific, barring, as I said, 1 or 2 countries like France or the UK, which has, it keeps holding those phone ops once in a while. But that's about it. I don't think this is even worth evaluating. It won't reach that spot, is my assessment.
Thank you, Mr. Dwivedi. And followed by it, I think the next question is about supply chain and the dependency on China that we have. So the question is, how long do you think it would take to decouple from the supply chain that we have with China, and if ever the world is serious about it? And #we means we refers to the key countries that matters. I guess the key countries would be the India, US, and European countries over here.
Hmm.
So that was the question by Mr. Gaj. Yeah,
So
and
nobody can
sorry.
decouple completely from China. It's not possible. No country can do that. But what can happen is bringing some trade rules in place. China happens to be the only country that continues to violate some of the basic premise and principles on which it was given admission to in WTO. It had 15-year period to become a market economy. It is nowhere close to becoming a market economy. It has disproportionate subsidies, market distorting subsidies. Its state-owned enterprises are the ones which impact local manufacturing in most other countries. And there's a lot of research and data that is available that for India, it is the toy industry that was impacted. For US, solar panel and steel are the two industries which are impacted. Steel is also the case for Japan. So these areas need to be kept in mind, because nowhere can you do complete decoupling. However, McKinsey did conduct a report and a study which said that if at all partial decoupling happens, which is over dependence on China stops, as is the case right now for several countries in several specific areas. If over dependence stops and engagement stops 15%, then there will be a $22 trillion impact on the world economy due to decoupling from China. So some of this pain is going to come for all countries. And how will they absorb this? Who will be able to absorb this? Are the questions. So my personal view is that when we are talking about decoupling, we are not saying that stop trading with China. It's not possible. As I said, it's the second largest economy in the world. How can you not trade with China? But what you can do is put in place certain measures. For instance, Chinese exporters get 17% rebate. How is that possible? How is that not market distorting? No exporter in any country can get 17% rebate, which means by very definition, they are out of market, they're out of business. Likewise, Chinese tariffs still continue to be much higher than the American and the European tariffs. These are WTO's figures and WTO studies that I'm saying. So these need to be put in place. If they are, then some of these distortions itself will end and put an end to how China is able to cause maximum damage, specifically in some areas. Like there is a study which says America lost 2.4 million manufacturing jobs in about 12 years. 2.4 million manufacturing jobs. All of them went to China. Or were just lost. So those areas need to be identified and plugged into. And I have no hope that WTO in its present form can do it. But then the idea is this should become a catalyst for that call for reform.
Okay, thank you. And coming back to this question, we talked about world and China. Now we'll be talking. Questions are more pertaining to India, China. The first question is by Mr. Pinto, and he's asking the rising India-China economic ties, even though there are trouble at the border. Earlier today, I think we all have seen that for the train 18, the Vande Bharat Express, we put out this a set of wheels order for the trains from Chinese. So I think the question is somewhere targeting towards that angle, saying like we talked about Make in India, we talked about Made in India, but at the same time we have problems at the border. But at the same time we do have this. It's a big order that is going towards China. So how does this reflects upon our relationship and given the tensions at the border? Yeah.
So personally, when you have to deal with excessive Chinese influence, and uh, and you have to deal with the possibility of China using its influence, then the first two, three areas that need to be identified, as the government rightly did, was the Chinese hardware, the Chinese software, and the Chinese apps, which is very important. And I'm glad that they did, and I hope this is a work in progress. It should not stop. Second is that on the trade aspect, one needs to keep in mind that some checks and balances need to be put in place. Like I said, the Indian toy industry has been massively hit by the Chinese influx of toys. They are, by the way, all rejects. They are all American rejects. They are European rejects that come here. But the influx has ensured that our domestic toy industry, which is labor intensive, has been completely destroyed. So those specific areas need to be handled. But if we are to say that our bilateral trade is increasing, therefore we are only talking and we are not doing anything against China, is very myopic, because we need to see trade as a holistic exercise. You can't stop your economy by delinking completely with China. You can't do that. Nobody can do it. But what you can do it is identify areas where the Chinese excessive influence needs to be reduced. As I mentioned, power is one area, steel is another area. Those need to be identified, slap a proportionate amount of duties, identify sectors and areas where more countervailing duties need to be put, so that cheap stuff does not make it through. Likewise, we've banned goods from Pakistan, but we all know that they either come through China or they come through Bangladesh. So those routes need to be plugged. They're very basic routes, but they need to be plugged. And that is where I believe more needs to be done. And I'm hopeful that this is a work in progress.
Thank you. I think when you mentioned about toy industry, I think the same goes for. There's a statement in newspaper or somewhere. I remember I was quite young back then that even the gods of India are made in China. So, like the kind of industry that has impacted our daily life, and we have seen definitely a resurgence of movements of like basic like developing a toy industry and the idols of the gods and goddesses that we pray, most of us pray, and things have been moved out. Yes, coming back to this Q&A, the next question by Mr. Raghu is talking about, his question is mostly about China building bigger and broader second bridge at Pangong So Lake that can carry armored columns. Earlier, they could carry soldiers. Earlier, wait, okay, yeah. Earlier, they can carry only soldiers and small vehicles, countering to this infrastructure development. But unfortunately, the terrain is fragile and is very sensitive. How do we, as we refers to India, balance infrastructure development to have better connectivity, keeping in mind about the environmental impact to counter China in the border areas? I think this is something that we have been discussing right before this. So I think you may please go ahead.
Yes, this is what I had said at the beginning of the conversation before we started, that nobody in China will ask a question related to environmental degradation when they build heavy infrastructure at the border. But everybody, rightfully so, will be asking the question to India. Now, what should India do? Should we keep in mind the environmental impact and not build commensurate infrastructure? In that case, we are talking about national security risk. Or should we go ahead, build even bigger infrastructure to counter the Chinese, and then worry about environmental degradation 2 years later? It's not an easy answer. None of this is an easy solution. But what makes decision making far more simplified in China is that it doesn't need to it's not a democracy. It doesn't need to deal with any two aspects of an equation. It has a single aspect of an equation, which is the CCP's view. That is the correct view. That's the only view that matters. So they implement it. And democracies need to have a response to that. So to say we are not going to build infrastructure is also incorrect. And I would say would be foolhardy, because then you are giving more possibility of facing the Chinese with bigger armored columns on the other side. Do we want to have that option? No. So some of these choices are difficult, but unfortunately not so gray as we make them out to be.
Thank you. I think that answers Mr. Raghu's questions as well, and followed by which we have a question by Mr. Neeraj. He's asking, do you think there is a solution in future to the MACMA online dispute, which China refuses to acknowledge? And why we, if we compare with US, Canada, the Western nations, and to us, there's a big gap in between us versus them, like when we compare it ourselves with China. So do you think there is some kind of solution to this kind of dispute that we are looking for?
I'm reading the whole comment, and what it says is that we must evaluate the possibility of having friendly ties. Or if we have to counter China, we must at least wait to reach the level it has. Uh, it's absolutely correct, and there is a chapter in the book which talks about how India needs to build on its economic power, more so because while India may help other countries, nobody is going to help India. And if nobody is going to help India when it comes to some of these tensions, we need to be far bigger than what we are. We are a 3 trillion, $3.5 trillion economy. We are competing with a 13, $14 trillion economy. We need to be at least half of that size, if not more, to be able to take on some of these issues, which is correct. But at the same time, there are some areas which are size agnostic, which is technology. It's size agnostic, and Israel can have a solution technology driven, which a country 5 times its size may not have. So technology, outer space, information narratives, these are size agnostic areas. And that's where I think India can be a very important player in shaping how the world responds to China. As for the military aspects, and as for the, specifically related to the McMahon line, Neeraj, I would want that there should not be a military escalation. And I would want that, we don't need to really test each other's military capabilities any further than what we have already. As for what will a solution possibly be, well, there is enough already being talked about that some of this will change, and I would not hazard a guess.
Thank you. I do have a question that I kept. I think I will be asking. My question is more pertaining to the Taiwan-China relations, and just in case there has been a debate that if the Chinese attacks Taiwan, there will be a blockage of semiconductor industry that has already been disrupted by this COVID. How much do you think can the world have? How much do you think is there any plan B beside Taiwan, which can remove that semiconductor wall around Taiwan that is stopping, or is that stopping China to attack to attack Taiwan, or is it something that is the US umbrella that is around Taiwan that is stopping China?
So there's a very incestuous relationship that China, America, and Taiwan have when it comes to semiconductors. So America sources its semiconductors from, and its chips primarily, chips from Taiwan. But Taiwan's semiconductor fab facilities are in China now. So it's a very incestuous three-way relationship, and nobody can block it, because if you block this, then you are looking at blocking every aspect of our daily life, every aspect, whether it's our economy, whether it's military, everything will come to a standstill when any of this chip movement stops. So it is not just in China's interest, it is in America's interest to ensure that this relationship doesn't get ruptured. Even at the height of the escalation of tensions between China and Taiwan, the chip manufacturing was not impacted at all. And the chip flow was also not impacted. There is movement for some of these fab facilities to be taken up in other parts. India has been talking about it. Unfortunately, I'm deeply disappointed that we've been talking about this for 17 years. That's how long I've been a journalist, and that's how long I've heard fab units will come and start in India. So it was started by a first person who spoke about it was Dayanidhi Maran in 2004. And I heard about it in 2005 in UPA 1. So I'm deeply disappointed in India's ability to not catch on to the train of the next big idea. But Indonesia is doing it. Indonesia has started work on it. And there will be some branching out of some of these fab units and some of these semiconductor facilities. And the reason why Indonesia is doing it is because they're going very big on electric vehicles. So whatever chips are needed for the electric vehicle ecosystem, they are making those. So if there is some diversification that happens out of China, out of Taiwan, then I think this will become robust in the next couple of years.
We do probably have a plan B to run our smart vehicles in future. So yes, thank you for this. Yes, I can see Sukanya's hand is up. Sukanya, if you may ask your question, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you, ma'am, for the presentation. I had two questions. One of the questions has been answered. Like indirectly, you have talked about China and how the countries are dependent, and it is one of the most influential power in the world. My second question, because the first one is answered, the second one is quite similar to what Professor Patak had asked. I just had a query. I just wanted to know how far do you think that China may align itself with Taliban in order to exploit Afghanistan rare earth metals? Because Afghanistan is rich in rare earth metals, and now with the disrupting and the government is not stable, and the population after US has retreated its troops, it is in a bad situation. So how far do you think that China may align with Afghanistan? Thank you, Professor.
So Kanya, there are two sides to it. One side is that many feel that for China, Afghanistan is ripe. They will roll out their BRI projects and they will mine the rare earth metals, which are worth trillions of dollars, and then they will make America rue the fact that they left Afghanistan even more. That's one side of it. But the other side, and which is more potent for China and more potent for Xi Jinping in argument, is that Afghanistan will start the East Turkmenistan movement even further. Already the Uyghur movement issue is a volatile issue for the CCP. It is a volatile issue for Xi Jinping. Afghanistan will make it an even bigger issue. The East Turkmenistan movement will get a fillip due to Taliban, due to the Taliban providing it all sorts of logistics, men, everything. And that is a bigger concern for Xi Jinping than the possibility of having major economic upside that may come from Afghanistan. And the other aspect related to BRI projects, which many feel Afghanistan is ripe for, is that China is having second thoughts, or must have second thoughts, after its experience with CPEC. The Pakistani projects, where it has pumped in $50 billion, committed another $30 billion. Nobody knows the exact amount of CPEC projects because they are not disclosed. Expectation is it anywhere between $70 to $80 billion. Those projects are now facing massive protests. They are facing serious amount of terror strikes from some of the Baloch Nationalist Party and some of these freedom fighters and struggles. That itself is now making the Chinese think that there may be limited upside, but massive downside to engaging with Taliban and engaging with Afghanistan as far as any economic interests are concerned. That's how I will read the situation. So
thank you for all the questions and responding to it, Mr. Dwivedi. And we did had a very thrilling session, and we did learn a lot from your perspectives. And with the respect of time and all, I have to call it a day for this wonderful talk. And we hope to host you sometime in our campus in the next semester, because this is our last teaching week and as well. So we look forward for continuing this discussion. And I also request to our audience to please switch on your cameras for a screenshot so that can be put up on the our channels. Yes. So please, everyone may.
Thank you so much, Dr. Panigrahi and Dr. Pathak. This was indeed a wonderful discussion, and Some of those questions were just very good and very pertinent. And I hope that we can continue this conversation, hopefully offline in a few months from now.
Sure. Okay, so I'm about to take the screenshot, and so just 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Dwivedi, and thank you everyone who joined us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks once again. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Lalitji.